This is George Gruhn at Gruhn Guitars in Nashville, Tennessee, ready for our Friday morning weekly question and answer session. The very first question from Zach Ovington: do you guys have a time frame for reopening the showroom? Well, the fact is, this is the fourth week that our showroom has been open by appointment. And in fact, if somebody walks up and doesn't have an appointment and they ring the doorbell, we are generally able to accommodate them, if not immediately, usually within a few minutes. So we are open, but we never did close completely at any time during the coronavirus pandemic. We had, from the very start of the lockdown period when the showroom was closed to the public, Gruhn Guitars was functioning with a skeleton crew to answer the phone, answer emails, online orders, appraisals, and receive and ship instruments. So we remained open, but now, as of this week, in addition to having the original skeleton crew back, we have a full contingent of salespeople in place in the showroom. And we brought back more of the repair staff. And next week, we plan to bring back more yet in repair to ramp up to full scale. So we are open by appointment, but also if somebody shows up, they can ring the doorbell, and as long as they've got a face mask, we will be wearing face masks, and we will expect our visitors to wear face masks and conform to the regular standards these days of social distancing, but we can handle it. So we are open and available. Next question, Jeff Bolick, Cleveland, Ohio. Are fakes still an issue with guitars, or is it pretty much a thing of the past? What is the most egregious fake you've encountered? Well, fakes are still very much an issue. The fact is, good guitars, as well as bad guitars, such as fakes, can last for generations of human lifetimes. So that a guitar, once created, can still be here 100 or more years from now. We have the oldest Martin I have here at the moment is 1836, but Stradivari died in 1737, and people are still playing Stradivari violins that he made. So if somebody builds a convincing-looking fake, or even a not-so-convincing-looking fake, unless it's removed from the marketplace by being destroyed, that thing is likely to be around for generations to come. And at this point, the majority of guitars that look like vintage V's and Explorers are fake. The more valuable the originals became, the more incentive there was to make better and better fakes. And every time there's an article or a book that offers suggestions on how to tell a fake from an original, some of the first people to get that are the forgers themselves, who then study all the points mentioned and do their best to follow your formula for how to spot the original from the fake and make sure their fakes have the earmarks of the original in those respects. But also I can say master tone banjos by Gibson that look like master tones pre-World War II flathead 5-strings, again, 99.9% are fake. And then there are some that have original bodies but replica necks, and the necks often enough have no marking to indicate that they are not original, but the body is still very valuable on those. The majority of mandolins that look like Lohr-signed F5s are fake. And there's been a variety of people making copies, including the name Gibson and Les Paul, of 59 style Les Paul sunbursts, and they vary greatly in quality. Some actually have been sought after enough that some musicians seek certain particular forgers. Some forgers got a reputation, but those still are trademark violation. And for a store like mine, we're not going to have them here because it would be illegal to sell, and Gibson can prosecute over things like that. And rightfully so, trademarks should be respected. But one does have to be careful when buying to deal with reputable sources. If you are not an expert yourself, you better get a good written guarantee of authenticity from the seller. And if that written guarantee of authenticity is not from a highly reliable and knowledgeable source, it may not be any better than the instrument itself. So phony certificates could also accompany fake instruments. Michael asks, can you discuss the best American boutique acoustic guitar builders, Dana Bourgeois, Richard Hoover at Santa Cruz, Lake Bill Collins, etc.? Is the main reason very few are in stock with you that essentially none of these models truly qualify as vintage, being that they've only been around a few decades? Well, the fact is we sell plenty of new guitars at Gruhn Guitars. We sell as many new Martins as used Martins. In fact, frequently sell more in a month than we do of used ones. So we are quite willing to acknowledge that there are new guitars that are very fine quality. In my opinion, they're not better than some of the true golden era instruments, the Gibson Electrics of the 50s and early 60s, or the Fender pre-CBS models, or the 1930s Martin and Gibson acoustics. Those are still the golden era. Those are the ones that bring the most, and those are the ones that are truly near and dear to me personally. But I happen to think very highly of some of the custom shop Martins we receive now. The reason we don't have a great number of the boutique builder guitars is that I'm not interested in having Martin clones if I have real Martins, especially custom shop Martins made to our specs. Bang for buck, I think that Martin still provides the best Martin style guitars, and I don't need a Martin style guitar made by somebody else. But we do have instruments by a variety of boutique builders, and in general, in order to stock something of that nature, I want it to be a very high quality instrument, and I want it also to be a very fine utility tool that will be price competitive so that it provides good bang for the buck. I'm not especially interested in trying to be a purveyor of very fancy ornamented guitars designed more to be put in a glass case for show and tell time than to be played. But the basic reason we don't carry a large selection of boutique builders is that for the most part, I'm not looking for guitars that try to compete head on with the Martin new instruments that I have in acoustic that I think are some of the best new acoustic guitars I've ever played, and that give more dollar value, more bang for the buck than almost any boutique builders out there. Rexford White, Nakano, I can't pronounce it. Anyway, Womack, Wisconsin. My father gave me a Gibson B25 as my first guitar in 1967 or 68, new. The guitar was stolen a few years later. Please provide a short history on this model. Although I don't have the serial number, what would be the approximate value had it not fallen into wrong hands? Well, in general, I don't do appraisals as part of this presentation, but this is a guitar that's basically a good utility tool. $1,200 to $1,400 for what you had if it was in fine original condition. The B25 basically is an instrument that when the LG2 name was discontinued for a guitar that looked essentially the same, the name was changed to B25. Why Gibson did that, I don't know. And I suspect that whoever decided to do that at this point is probably dead. 1962 being That's 58 years ago. That's not old enough to be in Gibson's acoustics a real true great vintage piece per se, although the J50s and J45s and J200s at that point do have some added value due to age, but not near as much as the true golden era of the 50s and earlier. But at any rate, the LG2 model was essentially about the same specs as an early B25, and they just renamed it. So they had the B25 name from 62 through 77, at which time that model was discontinued. Joe Beckers from the Netherlands. I own a 1955 Gibson Les Paul all gold, serial number 5 space 9608. What is the history on these old gold? Story on note from the 50s. Well, they were special order. They're not mentioned in the catalog. The typical catalog Les Paul model at that time had a gold top and natural finish, or at least a walnut stain on the wood, but clear lacquer over that in the 50s. But they were available from 52 onward through the 50s. And he goes on to ask, are they all gold to hide flaws in the wood? The answer to that, to the best of our knowledge, is no, they weren't hiding anything, just somebody ordered it all gold. Are they a kind of custom order? And the answer is yes, because in the ledger books, they do show up as being special order. So on customer request, Gibson would do this, but it was not in the catalog. Did Les Paul originally want Les Pauls to be all gold? And there's no evidence that he did. He apparently presented one as a gift to someone back in the 50s, but there's no evidence that he wanted them all to be that way or ever specified that as standard spec. He says further, it seems to him that in 54, 55, there were a lot of all golds made. Could that be a marketing thing to sell more? We see no evidence that there were more at that time. The factory ledgers show plenty in the period 52 and 3. And later than that, a lot of the ledger books are missing. We don't really know exactly how many were made. But so far as the exact percentage or the exact number made, we don't know. But I think it would be fair to say that no more than about 5% of the gold Les Pauls were all gold. Typically, they were gold top, so at least 95% of them were gold top with the clear lacquer on the back and neck. Why did Gibson stop making all gold Les Pauls after the mid-50s? The most probable answer is they were getting a lot sent back because the all gold or gold color at all, top or anywhere else, was achieved with very tiny brass flakes in the finish. And when perspiration or other moisture got at that, brass oxidizes green. And when it oxidizes, it will also cause the finish to crack, and further, it will cause the finish to peel off. So you'll see plenty of gold top Les Pauls where a player's arm passes over the top and it's turned green, and sometimes it's down to bare wood in that area. And you'll also see that a lot of them, if they were all gold, have severe deterioration of the finish on the back of the neck. In addition, on other metallic finishes that Gibson did, such as Pelham Blue or burgundy, the sparkling burgundy finish that is basically a gold finish with clear cherry stain lacquer on top, giving a metallic red look. Those things had the same problem on the back of the neck. And also, since the cherry red stain would tend to fade with exposure to UV light, sometimes you'll see one of those where the top or any other area that was exposed to a lot of sunlight simply turned gold and red faded away. But metallic finishes, such as Gibson did with brass flakes, do not do well for a finish on the back of the neck, because the player's sweat is going to cause severe oxidation and damage the finish. And they not only look bad, they become physically uncomfortable to play when that finish starts cracking and peeling. John Astle in Mint Hill, North Carolina, says that he got from a local dealer in the Carolinas a custom Martin OM earlier this year with wild grain East Indian rosewood. He also got it done with sinker mahogany neck block and end block. And would you mind giving me your thoughts and experiences around wild grain and playing guitars with that wood? Why would there be an upcharge in your opinion if it's just slab cut, not structurally as sound as its straight grain brothers? In general, that wild grain wood is slab cut. Some of it is absolutely beautiful. And slab cut rosewood, if it's well seasoned, can be stable enough to not be problematic for back and side. Slab cut spruce for a top would be hopeless. You would never use that. But slab cut maple and rosewood can be quite good. Is it going to sound better because it has this wild grain? The answer is no. But Martin did get some just gorgeously figured rosewood, and they do charge extra for that as a custom option. And basically you are paying for very attractive grain, but don't hold your breath waiting for it to sound better than the standard straight-grained Indian rosewood. It's not likely to, and it's certainly not structurally better. Now, I don't expect it to give you any trouble, but it's not structurally better than straight-grained quarter cut, which is the most stable, and it won't sound better, but it sure does look good. Scott Walter, I was wondering while watching your answers on YouTube how many of my favorite guitarists have been to your store over the decades. One in particular, Steve Howe of the band Yes. If so, could you share the experience of meeting him? Well, I met Steve on many occasions. Anytime he played a concert in Nashville, he'd always come in to see me. And over the course of years, he probably bought and arranged close to 100 guitars from me. That was mostly quite a few years ago. Steve's not been an active guitar buyer recently, but I've had quite a few players over the years who buy 100 or more guitars. Billy Gibbons with ZZ Top would be an example. Rick Nielsen, Eric Clapton's probably bought at least 75. Steve Stills probably bought 70, close to 40 or more, but that was back in the 70s. Neil Young bought at least 20 of them, but that also was back in the 70s. One thing about guitars is if you buy a good one, it lasts and lasts. So Neil still has his favorite guitars that he bought in the 60s and 70s. He still got them and he can still use them. So they're still good. They don't simply disappear. Thomas Sweeney, I have both a Gretsch and Gibson Archtop electrics. Both allow access to the electronics, pots, switches, jack, etc., only through the F-hole or removing the bridge pickup. Wouldn't it make sense to design an access panel in the back? Is there a structural or sonic reason why this isn't done? Well, an electric guitar is probably not much of a sonic reason to not have an access panel in the back, but it sure does look prettier on the back to not have it there. And when you're building it, it's really not all that much extra trouble when assembling it to have no access panel. And if you're going to be working on it, if you're a competent repairman, you should be able to work on it either way. So this is not really a major issue problem. If you're not skilled enough to be able to work on it without an access panel in the back, then you're probably not really skilled enough to do the quality of work that the guitar deserves to have. But in general, access panels on the back on hollow body electrics are simply unnecessary. And they look better without them. Alexander Zaris, it would be really cool to see a golden era Martin compared and contrasted to a fine contemporary custom shop model. Words are great, but what better than an audio-visual prop? Well, there's a great deal to be said for photos. So far as videos, for example, when I'm doing an appraisal of a guitar, I don't want video of the guitar. And I'm not interested in audio recording of it either. Videos are never as sharply focused and easy to examine in detail as still photos. Audio recordings tend to a very large extent to reflect the skill of the recorder, the recording engineer, the quality of the microphone, the quality of the processing done, and the quality of the playback unit that you have that you're listening to it, whether it be through headphones, speakers on a computer, or external high quality speakers. But it's often possible to take a guitar, which acoustically really doesn't sound all that great, and get it to record very well. It's extremely difficult to capture some of the nuances of a fine pre-World War II, 1920s or 30s flat-top guitar on a recording. I personally don't enjoy the sound of most recordings. They don't sound to my ear like a truly great acoustic. And it's awfully hard in a recording as well to capture the sound of an electric guitar through a really fine amp, cranked up enough to hear what it is capable of doing. When you're listening to the electric guitar, you're hearing the quality of the guitar so far as its own acoustic response, how this causes strings to vibrate, but you're also hearing the quality of the pickup, and you're hearing the quality of the amp, and you're hearing many different components because the same Les Paul plugged into 3 different amps may be 3 different sounds right there. So lots of people want to see a video and they want to hear audio, but in general, recorded audio is not where it's at for me. I want to hear the guitar live, and I hear plenty of recordings that make poor sounding acoustics sound remarkably good, and I've heard plenty of recordings that simply do not capture. In fact, I'll go as far as to say I've never heard a recording that truly captures the nuances that I hear coming from a really great acoustic played by a really great player. I've heard when Brian Sutton or Vince Gill come in that they can get sounds that I have never heard on a recording. And that those sounds are some of the things that actually distinguish a truly great acoustic from the average. So that's why, in general, that's not the way I try to present guitars. And it certainly is not the way I would ever buy guitars, not based on a recording. Mark Menza, and he's one of several who've asked for my opinion on torrefied woods employed by some builders today to simulate the response to vintage instruments. And I've answered this before, but I'll say it again. Torrefied wood is wood that's heated at a relatively high temperature, as much as like 370 degrees in an oxygen-free environment. And it is claimed that it will simulate aging of wood. Well, it does look like aged wood, but it's actually more brittle physically. and the sound and harmonic response to my ear is not the same. And I do not prefer it to aged wood. It has been highly promoted by a number of builders. The custom mortar guitars I have made for me by Martin do not have that wood. Martin does make authentic series guitars with the torrefied tops, and they do sound good. I've heard some that actually sound very good, but in my opinion, they don't sound any better or even as good as if they made the identical guitar with non-torrefied wood. But my personal opinion of torrefied wood is similar to the story Grimm's fairy tales of the Emperor's New Clothes. And for those of you who are familiar with the fairy tale, you'll know what I mean. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's a short fairy tale. Look it up and read it. For Ted Silverman, and several people have asked, despite the general assumption that Japanese guitars from makers like Ibanez, Alvarez, Yamaha, and others are less attractive to American collectors, can you please speak to the quality on the high end and playability of many of these instruments? And what I can say is that as early as 1974, when I made a visit to Japan, I found that there were Japanese-made instruments that were good quality. They were typically those made for the domestic Japanese market rather than for export because they cost a lot. Because in '74, labor was cheaper in Japan than in the US, but everything else cost more. Real estate cost more, raw materials cost more, fuel cost more, shipping cost more to get it here, plus there was duty on it, whatever. But Japanese guitars today are not competitive in price, because labor now in Japan costs fully as much as in the USA. And everything else costs a lot more. Even today, there are Chinese instruments that are remarkably good. I have some Altamira brand gypsy jazz guitars that are remarkably good guitars. And there are other brands as well that are making good ones. And there are Japanese violin makers and Chinese violin makers as well, producing some absolutely gorgeous violins that you could take and play in the symphony. They're not better than the real Strad, but they're pretty damn good. And the quality keeps getting better. And with the use of CNC, computer numeric control equipment, you can take a CNC machine and put it in a factory in Indonesia. And if you have good management and good materials and a good program in that machine, you can be producing necks that feel good and bodies that are shaped properly. And if you buy good component electronics and put in an electric with those tooled, well-tooled necks and bodies, you get good quality guitars. Are they better than a custom shop Gibson or Fender? No. But do they compare remarkably well, bang for buck? They're pretty darn good. And some of them are absolutely good enough to take on stage and use professionally, no question about it. And companies like ESP in Japan are making excellent quality electric guitars, but there are major artists using them. And Yamaha's upper level instruments also are very well made. So CNC equipment has made quite a difference. And the management in some of these factories is actually quite knowledgeable. So they are getting to be competitive. Do they build better guitars than anything made in the USA? No. But are they competitive and are they getting better year by year? The answer is yes. Are they good enough that the better quality Asian imports can be used on stage professionally? The answer is absolutely yes. And more is still to come. There is no reason why a guitar made in Japan can't be every bit as good as one made here. And for that matter, as the Chinese get better and better, there's no reason why they also can't build guitars that can be every bit as good as ours. They're not any less intelligent as people than we are. They have access to the same materials that we do. They have access to the same technology that we do. And when it's economically feasible to do so, they will make good quality. And they have a domestic market of their own, with people who are making more and more money now, where the standard of living is going up in those countries. And there's a demand domestically as well as for export models to make high quality instruments. Times keep moving on. So, another question, Don Sarlin, and this similar to one asked before, but how do you feel about high-end guitars with bolts holding the necks on, Collings, Bourgeois, etc.? Any negative impact on tone of this? The problem is that in a scientific experiment, we like to change only one variable at a time. I've never heard a Martin with a bolt-on neck that was constructed otherwise exactly the same as their guitars that have a dovetail. The ones with the bolt-on necks from Martin are their technology series, and they also have their technology series bracing pattern, which isn't used on any of their guitars with a dovetail. And the dovetail also comes hand in hand with their more traditional bracing. I need to hear things like a Collings guitar made identical to their bolt-on model, but with a dovetail. I haven't heard that. And I'd need to hear a Martin that's identical to their traditional design, except with bolt-on. I haven't heard that either. So can I give you a straight answer to that question? No. And besides, every maker, whether they try, it seems as hard as they may try to copy somebody else, they all seem to somehow sound like themselves. A certain essence of Gibson, essence of Martin, essence of Collings that seems to pervade each one of those makers' instruments, so that there's too many variables going on to separate it down to exactly what is the influence on sound of the bolt-on neck for me to give you the straight answer. Mark Menza says, I have 7 good Gibson and Fender guitars and a 60s flamenco guitar, and wants to trade to buy a 1959 ES345 for his future estate. Any thoughts? Well, I'm easy enough to reach. Here I be. I do happen to have a 345 that conforms to your specs. And really, for anybody who has a bunch of guitars, if they want to trade something for something else, I'm not the only one out there you can contact. What you need to do is just contact me and any other dealers that you can think of. They have what you want. Tell them what you've got. Send photos. Let us know what you have in mind, and we'll try to work with you. And in that sense, Gruhn Guitars is ready to help you, and so are my competitors. I'm not the only one in the world doing this, but I happen to have one exactly like you're asking for, and I'm perfectly open to trading. And I'm not the only guy out there that you can talk to about that. But certainly, I like it when people do deal with me. But I will openly admit that we're not the only ones out there who have good guitars. You have lots of options. If you have instruments that add up to the value, me and numerous other dealers stand ready to help you. There's a Leonardo asking about how do the less expensive PRS SE guitars compare to the US made ones in terms of build quality, electronics, and tone. And as I was already saying, Japanese, Korean, Indonesian quality, past and present. Past wasn't so good. Present is remarkably good, bang for buck. And that's true not just of PRS imports, but it's true of other imports too. PRS import guitars are of fine quality. Are they better than their USA made ones? No. But are they good enough to play on stage and use professionally? Yes, they are. And so are instruments made by other manufacturers. Asian quality has improved by leaps and bounds, but Japanese quality quality has actually been very good, even as early back as 1974 when I was over there. The models that were made for domestic consumption were really good. And in fact, some of them were better quality copies of old Gibsons and Fenders than either Gibson or Fender were making in 74 and even into the early 80s. But some of those Japanese instruments that were Fender and Gibson clones were remarkably good. David Schmidt, how do you compare the D28 Marquis to the new authentic D28? Well, the Martin no longer offers the 28 Marquis, but the Marquis was essentially very similar to their golden era model, except it was a Indian rosewood back and sides and had a non-torrified Adirondack spruce top with scallop bracing and had an adjustable truss rod in the neck. The new authentic series are made to be more of a copy of what was done in the 30s, and they have a 37 authentic and a 39 authentic, so 39 authentic copies of 39 specs, 37 copies of 37 specs. There's differences in the bracing and neck dimensions. But the authentic series have a non-adjustable tempered steel T-bar in the neck, like was used in the 30s, whereas the Marquis had a adjustable rod. The Marquis, as I said, has an Adirondack spruce top, and it was non-torrified wood at that time. But the neck dimensions of the Marquis were more modern, and it was not trying to copy exactly a 30s spec neck. The vintage series, the authentics now all have torrified Adirondack, which I have mixed feelings on. They also offer authentics with aged finish, relic finish. You can get it with or without relic finish. They're very good guitars, but actually the Marquis were also very good guitars, and they stack up pretty well, but they're not truly equivalent instruments. Their specifications are actually quite different. With the only thing they really share in specs is that they can do D28 ornamentation. Size, the Marquis did have herringbone trim. The authentic has herringbone trim, but the wood on the authentic today is torrified. The neck dimensions are different. The authentic is put together with hide glue. The Marquis was not. They're truly not equivalent guitars, but the Marquis is discontinued and was a good guitar. Jason Wu says, I wondered how the difference in sound between the authentic D28 vintage to a real vintage D28 of the 1960s. Well, they're totally different specs. In the 1960s, Martin guitars had a Sitka spruce top with non-scalloped bracing, and it would be in a 1/11/16 neck width at the nut. The new authentic series have totally different specifications. They're simply not comparable, but the D28 of the 1960s had Brazilian rosewood back and sides. The new authentics don't use Brazilian rosewood, they use Madagascar rosewood. But in general, the specs of these guitars are so different that they look, feel, and sound totally different. And I would say overall that the authentic series is in many ways a better guitar than the D28 of the 1960s, because in the 60s, a Sitka spruce with non-scalloped, fairly heavy bracing simply was not going to produce a type sound that you can get out of an Adirondack spruce top, either with torrification or not. Adirondack spruce just produces, in my opinion, a better sound than Sitka, and the scalloped bracing also gives a more responsive sound. But again, these guitars look, feel, and sound so different that they're just not really truly comparable. 1960s was old enough to have some vintage appeal, especially because it has Brazilian rosewood, but is definitely not, for Martin, what I would consider a true golden era vintage guitar. It's old enough to call it sort of semi-vintage, but it's not the golden era period. And for that matter, vintage as a term is not so useful anymore. When I opened up my shop in 1970, a 50-year-old guitar was 1920 and the D28 hadn't even been introduced yet. In fact, there were no electric guitars at that time, and Martin didn't make any steel string guitars. They were gut strings, so things have changed. When I opened up a 30-year-old guitar, it was 1940. Today, we'd consider that a true vintage instrument, and even then we did, but it was radically different from what was available new in 1970. But today, a 30-year-old guitar is 1990, and that ain't vintage, and it's not golden era either. But golden era is a more steady term to use because that which was golden era before in 1970 still is today. Vintage as a function of age is almost meaningless now. Golden era, it's still the Martin guitars of the 1920s and 30s. It's Gibson flat tops of that same period. But for electrics, the great golden era was the 50s into the very early 60s. But each maker has its own golden era. And each individual luthier, probably his best will be some of his most recent, because the more experience he has, the better he gets. So vintage has become a term that today doesn't really have as useful meaning as it once did, but golden era still works. Steve Morrison, I need help with a 1968 Paul, Les Paul, I assume, with a 66 serial number. Send me photos and a serial number, because there were no Les Pauls made in 66. And a 68 shouldn't have a 66 serial number. But Gibson did repeat serial numbers. So throughout the 60s, serial numbers would hop, skip, and jump with Gibson. And there were many numbers used, 2, 3, or even more times than that. Gibson repeated numbers quite a bit. So in this particular instance, my email address is george@guitars.com, GUITARS.com, george@guitars.com. Send me photos, serial number, and your question for this or any other questions any of you wish to send to me personally, and I will respond. Brian Rucker, I have a 1947 Gibson L7 guitar. I like to keep it clean. It has an annoying habit of corroding on the pickguard assembly. I've noticed the same on other arch tops. What can be done to eliminate the problem? What is the cause? Well, your guitar has a nitrocellulose tortoiseshell grain pickguard, and any kind of plastic pickguard, even some of their black guards that were beveled edge, start to chemically deteriorate, and they outgas very corrosive nitric fumes that are acidic, and they will cause metal that they come in contact with to corrode severely. So you'll see corrosion on the frets and any of the metal fixture fittings to hold the pickguard in place. And if you don't do anything about it, it gets worse and worse and will start to eat into the lining of your guitar case. And in some cases will also eat up the finish under the guard. So it can be very damaging. And this is something that the company had no way of knowing, that they had plastic that would have a 40-year time fuse. Plastic was considered something that would be non-biodegradable. They thought it might be around to the, some fossils in the future, 60 million years from now. Maybe aliens would land on Earth and they'd find fossilized stuff with the plastic still intact. Well, it doesn't work that way. Many of these plastics are nowhere near as stable as wood. But the problem with your guitar is the pick guard is starting to decompose, and that guard needs to come off. You may have to have another guard made as a replica guard, but the longer you leave it there, the more damage that guard will do. Pascal Caputo, what's the outlook for the collectability of 1950s Gibson L50 guitars? The L50 was a student model Gibson arch top. It was the cheapest arch top acoustic non-cutaway guitar with a spruce top. They had an L48 with a laminated mahogany top that was right priced below it, but L48s and L50s are good utility tools. Their prospects becoming collectible in my lifetime are not good. In your lifetime, regardless of how old you, the listener, may be, I have a feeling that there'll be good utility tools, but probably not a collectible guitar in the foreseeable future, unless Gibson just goes out of business and anything with a Gibson name on it is sort of semi-collectible. Austin Mann, doesn't seem to be a question as much as he says, in 1995, you obtained the original prototype for the Flying V, which had been originally given to the company in Chicago that made all the cases for Gibson guitars. And yep, I did have such a guitar. I don't know if it was the one and only prototype, but it was a prototype, and it was in its prototype case. And Gibson gave them the guitar in exchange for having a prototype case that they needed to inspect before giving approval to go ahead and manufacture, keeping in mind that at that time, a Flying V cost less money new than a new Les Paul. And so, because this was a guitar made probably early 58 or late 57 as a prototype, and the case, they needed to design the case, but since the V only cost like $247.50 when it was new, Sunburst Les Paul was $265, and Gibson charged half that to a dealer, and the Gibson factory actually had to pay 30% to CMI, Chicago Musical Instrument Company, that owned them. So actually, what this guitar would have cost Gibson to give to the case company was basically half of 247 minus 30%. So it was not that big a deal for Gibson to give away a guitar at the time. Robbie Grice, I have a 1965, parentheses, I think, Gretsch double anniversary in cherry red. I've never seen another. Usually they're green or sunburst. Any info? I have a feeling that the problem is that Gretsch repeated serial numbers, and it depends where this serial number is located. If the number's on the tip end of the peg head, that's earlier than if it's a number that can have the same number on the back of the peg head, and they were different number series. Again, my advice is send me photos and the serial number to my email address, george@guitars.com. And I suspect that what you have is something made later and not in 65, but with photos and the serial number, we'll figure out what you have. Because with Gretsch, that number and just where it's stamped and how it's stamped tells me which number sequence it really is. And the same number can mean 2 or 3 different things depending on when that guitar was made and where they stamped it. Bill Stepno, I had an old Gibson mandolin in mint condition, but kept it stored too long. Pencil eraser size spot appeared on the pick guard. Next time I opened the case, both E strings were broken right over that little spot, but I didn't realize what was going on. Well, I think I already just explained a few minutes ago what was going on. That nitrocellulose tortoiseshell pick guard was outgassing acidic fumes, which caused things that they come in contact with to corrode, which corroded and then broke both of those strings, and the pick guard needs to go bye-bye. And you'd still want to save the fittings so that you could put them onto a replica guard, but the nitrocellulose deteriorating guard needs to be removed because it will only cause more and more trouble as time goes by. Tom Van Tilburg, An earlier segment, you had mentioned that on a Gibson Les Paul, the strings should be strung over the top of the tailpiece, the stop tailpiece. When I purchased mine new in 2015, it came strung through the center. Could you please clear this up for me? I have a feeling that they had somebody at the factory that day who maybe was new on the job, but that's not really the way it was designed to be strung. You can get a bit more tension downward that way, but the tailpiece, of course, is designed to be adjustable up and down, and the best sound may vary a bit from one guitar to another as far as how much tension downward you want on the bridge, but cranking it all the way down is typically not the best sound. Mark Finney, I have a 1928 Epiphone Model 4 acoustic guitar, acetate peghead veneer. Never seen another out there or for sale anywhere else. What can you tell me about this guitar? I'm thinking about possibly selling or trading it. I believe it is quite rare. Yes, it's very rare. They did make styles 0 through 4, and but this is a model that at that time was an arch top oval hole instrument that is a good sounding instrument, but extremely rare enough that it would be hard for me to come up with a very accurate going market rate. We don't see enough of them, but it's one that, please send me photos, george@guitars.com. And I can tell you, yes, I would be interested in it. And as I said before, in all honesty, we must admit that I'm not the only dealer in the world who might be interested, but certainly I would like to talk to you about it if you wish to deal with me. But it is a guitar that would have collector's item appeal. And I would certainly like to hear from you, george@guitars.com. Or you got our phone number, you can call. John Smith, did you ever meet Carlo Greco, Guild luthier from the 60s and 70s? Are the Guild guitars he built marked in some way? I have heard that there's no record from Guild by serial number of the guitars he built for them. And that's true. There's not that I know of, but he was a foreman out there. And he did make some of the very high-end Guild classicals, such as the Mark 7. And that was made by him. They're very rare. Later, after leaving Guild, he set up a shop of his own in New York. And we've seen a modest number of Carlo Greco guitars. I've got a Carlo Greco arch top upstairs in our repair shop right now that we need to do some setup on, but it's a well-made, interesting guitar. And I have a friend who has several of them he likes quite well. So he is a known builder. His reputation is more limited to folks mostly in the New York area where he set up shop after he left Guild. But he was a competent, good builder. He is now deceased. Anthony LaFleur, I've always been attracted to Rickenbacker guitars. I feel that they're good quality instruments, although it's a bit odd in design through the years. In their shop at Santa Ana, and several models remains, to me, among the best looking guitars on the market today. For some reason, these guitars don't seem to be as sought after as I would expect. What are your thoughts? Well, in general, Rickenbackers are usually not regarded as being highly versatile compared to a Fender or a Gibson, and even not as versatile perhaps as a Gretsch, but they have certain jangly sounds nothing else has. They sound different. And the Rickenbacker 12 strings are quite sought after. McGuinn with the Byrds used a Rick 12, and George Harrison with the Beatles used a Rick 12, and John Lennon also had several Rickenbackers, and the models that are associated with the Beatles are certainly highly sought after. And the 1950s Capri series hollow body Ricks bring significant money, in some cases well over $10,000. So it's not that they aren't sought after, but they sought after model rigs are quite rare. It's a relatively small company. Even today is a small company. So we just don't see all that many of them, of the vintage ones, compared to Gibson, Fender, and Gretsch that made a heck of a lot more guitars. But the early Rickenbacker guitars are certainly quite saleable, highly marketable, and we can always use them, but we wish we had more of them, actually. Eric O. in Woodstock, Georgia. In the last 10 years or so, Gibson and Fender have introduced several guitars with innovative features. For example, Gibson Les Paul, HP guitars with robot tuners and DIP switches, and Fender Elite/Ultimate Stratocasters, Telecasters with S1 switching. What do you think? What do you see the values and future collectability of these guitars in the future? In general, I don't see great collectability for any one of those in the future, but I see that the Fenders with those features will be good utility tools. They were good utility tools on day one, and they'll remain so. They're versatile, but do I think that they will become highly collectible? I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for that. Do I think that the Gibson guitars with robot tuners will be collectible? The answer to that is absolutely not. I think that those tuners are absolutely horrifically terrible. And they have too many moving parts. If any one component on any one of the tuners doesn't work, the whole system doesn't work. They're big and clumsy looking. And we've tried them, and they're temperamental. Gibson ended up in a lawsuit with the manufacturer of them. The resale value of the guitars with those is miserable, but the guitars with those robot tuners typically also have weird electronics, which is just not incompatible with any alternative pickups, and the neck dimensions are asymmetrical, and they had a metal nut that was not a very good design. And Henry Juskowitz, the company president at that time, when those were introduced, had trouble with pushing the low and high E strings off the edge of the fingerboard, but he wasn't the greatest of players. But so he wanted the neck made wide so you couldn't push the strings off the edge, but the spacing was still the same as on the standard 1/11/16 inch nut width guitars. So the spacing string to string was like on the narrower necks. You had lots of space on either side of the fingerboard. And those guitars just were a real liability for Gibson. They lost millions of dollars on those, and rightfully so. I don't expect those to become collectible. John Parsons, I read somewhere the description of an instrument at Gruhn says fine sounding or exceptionally fine sounding means that you've actually played it and given it the thumbs up. Is that true? The answer is yes. Generally, with vintage acoustics, when I'm describing them, and I do work with Eric, who's the company president, general manager, and my stepson, he and I do the vintage instrument descriptions together. And I do like to take a bit of time to try out some of those instruments. And if I say it's exceptional sounding, then in my opinion, it darn well is. And I don't say that lightly. We don't simply say that they all sound exceptional. It's not a matter of which model it is. Just because it's a herringbone D does not mean I'm going to say it sounds exceptional. Some herringbone Ds in general sound very, very good, but some be better than others. And I do play them, and I do express opinions. I've not claimed not to be opinionated. Anybody who listens to me doing a question and answer session knows that I do have opinions. I don't claim to be infallible. I don't claim to be omniscient. When I become either omniscient, infallible, or omnipotent, I'll be sure to let everybody know right away. But in the meantime, I have not achieved that. I try to learn new things every day. In fact, I feel like if you're not learning something new every day, then either you're getting senile or you no longer care, and neither one of those are good attributes. So I'm still a student of guitars. I'm still learning. And the older I get, the more I discover how much there still is to learn. I don't know it all. I do have a good staff. And having a staff also means that when I'm doing appraisals, evaluations, and just decisions in general, sometimes the team helps. There are some times when people in my repair shop or elsewhere may know something that I don't know. And when we are looking at guitars, trying to verify authenticity, any questions we may have will generally get examined by more than just me. But with a team, we're all the more powerful. George Scanelli. In regard to Guild guitars, I've never owned one. I do recall that back in the late 60s through early 70s, they were regarded as very good guitars, and they still are around today. What is your overall feeling about Guild guitars? Well, Guild's been around making guitars from '53 to the present, but the company's changed a lot over the years. I was personally involved with Guild, starting to design guitars for Guild in 1984. And continued that through '88. And in August of '86, I became their executive vice president of research and development and artist relations, and stayed in that position through '88. And I will humbly say that in my opinion, since I do have opinions, the Guild acoustic models that I designed are some of the best, if not the best, acoustic guitars Guild ever made. And I also designed the Guild Nightbird Electric, which in my opinion may well be the best electric guitar Guild ever made, but they don't make them anymore. Guild was started in New York by Alfred Drange, and after relatively few years, they moved to Hoboken, New Jersey, right across the Hudson River. You could look from Hoboken and see right across the river, see the skyline of New York better than you could see it anywhere in New York. So it was, in fact, if you take the PATH train, 8 minutes from Hoboken, New Jersey, you can be right in Greenwich Village in New York City. But anyway, they stayed there through till the late 60s, when they moved to Westerly, Rhode Island. And Alfred Drange unfortunately died in a plane crash, and his company was sold, taken over by Avnet, a big holding company. And in my opinion, quality did go down. And Avnet owned Guild until I was part of a group that bought Guild. I wasn't in control of Guild, though. I was one of the shareholders. That was in August of '86, and I was their executive vice president of research and development and artist relations, as I said. I also found that even though I was on the board of directors, I was a minority shareholder, and I found that as a minority shareholder, it was less than joyful. In fact, one could study Guild and probably write a master's or a PhD thesis on how not to run a company by the way it was run during that period. It bankrupted in '89. And then it got taken over by Chuck Foz, who never really did pull it into profitability. And then he sold it to Fender, and Fender then moved it to Corona, California. And they kept it there for a few years and were not particularly successful with it. And then Fender bought Tacoma, the Tacoma Guitar Company, and they moved production of Guild there. Tacoma actually was a company I designed guitars for, and that was another where I found the joys of not being truly enough in control. None of the Tacoma models I made they are no longer in production, but Tacoma was, when they were in trouble, they were sold to Fender, and I actually had recommended that they contact Fender. Fender was looking for some place to build Guilds that would be better than Corona. And Guilds were built there for a few years, except then when the lease came up on the factory, Fender sold, or just moved it. They didn't sell it, they moved it to the Ovation factory, which they owned because Fender had acquired Command Music. So they started making Guilds there, and they kept redesigning it. And then later, that wasn't profitable, and they just shut it down. And then finally, that got sold to the present owners, who now are making them in California. So Guild guitars are still in production today, but they are, at this point, no more Guild than if I had, the name is still there, the trademark is there, and they make some guitars that resemble old Guilds, but it reminds me of the family heirloom that my family has. We have Abraham Lincoln's original axe, but we've treasured it over the years, so we've used it a lot. So we had to replace the head twice and the handle 3 times, but we treasure Abe's axe and would never sell it. And to me, Guild isn't really Guild, but for that matter, if you use those same standards, Gibson has, not in the same building that it used to be, not in the same city that it used to be. It's changed owners several times. It was in Kalamazoo, Michigan from the beginning until 1984 when they shut down the factory there. And but they actually did open a Nashville factory in '74, so they ran 2 factories at Nashville and Kalamazoo for 10 years. And then after 10 years, they moved completely and shut down that factory. And now heritage guitars are made in the old Gibson factory, still there in Kalamazoo. But Gibson changed owners, and Norland bought Gibson in 1970. CMI bought Gibson in '44, Chicago Musical Instrument Company. Norland bought Gibson in '70. Henry Juskowitz and his partners, David Berryman and Gary Zabrowski, bought Gibson beginning of '86. And now it's under new management after a bankruptcy reorganization. So many companies have changed. But the new Guilds are good guitars, but it's a very different company from the old Guild, although it still has the name Guild. Bill Maxstad, do you have any recommendations for sound hole pickups, acoustic guitar, instrument amplifiers, and all-around use in flat top guitars? And again, I don't really want on this type program to make specific recommendations other than sound hole pickups in general are not what most of the players like, but Baggs makes a good one. And a number of other companies are making good sound hole pickups, but typically the sound hole pickups are magnetic pickups, and they just don't have a truly acoustic sound. But some of them still sound quite good. I believe Duncan also has a sound hole pickup. Most of the players who want an acoustic to be amplified want an internal pickup, which is likely to be Pizier pickup or microphone inside the guitar. And there are numerous makers these days who do a good job. So Sunrise makes a good pickup, Baggs makes a good pickup, Fishman makes pickups in large quantity. Fishman is probably the largest volume maker of pickups for acoustic amplification. And there are plenty of good makers at this time for amplification of flat top guitars, acoustic guitars in general, enough that I can hardly say which one is really going to be the best, but there's numerous ones that work quite well. Dan O'Brien, I have several really nice high quality acoustic guitars, some rosewood, some maple, and some mahogany. Lots of great guitar players have played them. A couple of the maple guitars seem to be everybody's all-time favorite sounding guitars. Is there a reason why maple is not regarded more highly in the guitar world? Well, actually maple is well regarded. If you talk about electric guitars, maple is a staple for lots of them. For archtop acoustic jazz guitars, maple is the standard for backsides and necks. And for flat top acoustics, there are plenty of makers that use maple as well as mahogany and rosewood. So there's lots of options. And maple can do a great job. Typically, you'll want to have it a different thickness than you'd use for mahogany or rosewood. But there's, in order to get the right sound, rosewood, mahogany, and maple have different characteristics. Maple tends to be bright, but I've heard some wonderful sounding maple flat tops. It's just a matter of having a maker who knows how to use it. Bill C, like your opinion on aged tops, do they really make a difference for the better? I don't know what you mean by aged. Naturally aged, I like. Torrefied tops, I've already said that. I've discussed that at some length in this session, so I think I need not say more. But when you say aged top, are we talking about naturally aged or artificially aged? Artificially aged, in my opinion, I don't like as well. But I've still heard torrefied tops that did sound good. But I still deep down feel that the ones that sounded good with a torrefied top probably still would have sounded better if it was a naturally aged top. Scott Williams, what is your opinion of Gibson J165 and CJ165 guitars produced around 2006? And he feels they are very fine quality. And, they are good quality guitars. Mostly the people who are using those are playing them plugged in. But the fact is, I think that their value is utilitarian. I don't expect them to become collectible, but they are very serviceable guitars. He also wants to know my opinion about Richlite fingerboards. Richlite is it's vegetable fibers pressed to look like wood. It can be stained to look sort of like rosewood or ebony. It is quite stable. It's cheaper than either ebony or rosewood. And personally, I'd rather have ebony or rosewood. If you're paying the price for a good guitar, then it doesn't cost all that much more to get a genuine ebony board or a genuine Indian rosewood board. And I'd certainly rather have ebony or rosewood. The manufacturer's cost difference in producing the guitar is probably not more than $2 or $3 different. And I'd sure rather have a real wood fingerboard. For Terry White, as a Les Paul Deluxe board used in '72, experienced too much feedback. He had the pots, the tone and volume, the pickups, excuse me, the pickups were potted, wax potted by Seymour Duncan. Did he significantly reduce the value of the instrument? Please comment on guitars with mini pickups and their market desirability. Well, in general, most of the players prefer the large size, full size humbuckers, but I've certainly heard guitars that sounded good with the mini humbuckers. Firebird guitars have the mini humbuckers, but the Firebirds don't have adjustable poles on theirs. But in general, if it's a good quality guitar, you can get good sound out of either type humbucker, but the mini humbuckers are a bit more trebly sounding. They still are good. Did he reduce the value greatly? I would say a Seymour Duncan potted pickup is not going to dramatically change the value. Richard Buse, the majority of Gibson B4512s that I see have the trapeze tailpiece. What years did they come with the belly bridge? Well, the very first of them in the early 60s had a trapeze, only very briefly. But then they went shortly thereafter to a glued-on bridge, and they stayed with the glued-on bridge right on to the late 60s. It would have been right around 67. Actually, Gruhn's Guide to Vintage Guitars, we can look up the Gibson B45 and find it pretty quick, and it should probably tell us exactly which year they did that. But the ones with the trapeze tailpiece from the late 60s do not sound as good and are not as sought after as the ones with the glued on bridge. And the trapeze tailpiece came in around mid 65. And it stayed that way through the 60s. But then in the 70s, they went back to having a glued-on bridge, but the 70s guitars are not very good sounding. for we're sort of closing in on it, but Bob Stepnow wanted to know our opinion on Martin Shenandoah guitars. The Shenandoah guitars were built by Terada in Japan for the necks and bodies. They were imported with no finish on them, and the necks were bolt-on style, and they became neck and bodies bought from Terada, and the Martin would lacquer them and assemble and glue on the bridge. And at least early on, they were stamped as made in USA because Martin felt that there was more dollar spent on the assembly work in the USA, enough to call it made in USA. And they continued to do that until Gibson had a line of Nouveau guitars that they were doing the same thing, calling them made in USA. And US Customs got after them and said, hey, you can't do that. And then they said, well, Martin does it. And then they said, oh, and then Martin had to stop that as well. So Martin then had later the models, Shenandoahs had a assembled jet made in Japan and assembled in USA, different labeling. But shortly after that, they just simply discontinued them. Chuck Dale Smith, did you ever have any contact with Mike Bloomfield? And the answer to that is very much so. I was a student at the University of Chicago starting in '63. I knew Mike. He went to the University of Chicago High School. I knew him when he played in the Butterfield Blues Band. He was a brilliant player. And if I had to pick the one boy who made vintage electrics really sought after, it was him. When I started out collecting guitars in '63, collectible guitars were all acoustics. And it was a fairly small number of people who were truly sophisticated collectors. But when Bloomfield started to play electric guitar, playing first a pre-CBS Telly, and later a 54 gold top Les Paul, and a couple of years later yet, the 59 Sunburst Les Paul, which he actually asked me, could I find him one, the 59 Burst? And I couldn't. I looked around, and the fact is they weren't expensive yet, but they only made about 1,500 of them. Those were distributed worldwide. I couldn't find one for him quick enough. He found one from Dan Earlywine, who he traded in his 54 gold top to Dan Earlywine, got a 59 Burst. But yes, I knew Mike quite well. I think that Mike was probably the person single-handedly more responsible for Gibson ending up having enough demand for Les Pauls that they reintroduced Les Pauls in '68, but they certainly never gave Mike any credit for that. But prior to the reintroduction, I had people asking me, why is it called a Les Paul? Who or what was that? I even had one guy ask me if I could find him a Les Paul model. Les Paul, you know, like French. At any rate, yes, I knew Mike. And that's it for this week. I'll look forward to a new session next Friday. I'm easy to reach in the meantime, george@guitars.com. Any questions you have, you want to correspond with me on personally, I'm readily available by phone here at the shop, 615-256-2033, or by email, which I do personally answer. Thanks, and see you next week.